I am Melody Fawcett. I'm 59 years old and I am in Seattle, Washington. And I'm recording today with my colleague and friend.
Hi, Melody. I am Tim Serban. I am 57 years old. I am a colleague of Melody, and I have served with Providence for these 29 years. Well, when I first came to Providence in 1993, I walked into Providence St. Vincent Hospital. Everywhere you turned at that time, there were Sisters of Providence, from the front desk to part of the chaplaincy team to the lab, and pretty much everywhere you were, they were there. I realized that the image that I had of Providence was what I would describe as a pioneering organization. I mean, here you have Sister Mother Joseph, who came west across treacherous seas and landed in Vancouver and then started the first hospital in Oregon. And they were willing to take incredible risks. But I always found that Providence tended to lean into change in a proactive way. The image that I have is a person who goes to the edge of an ocean cliff and leans out over the edge and leans into the opportunity, leans into the challenge, and is not afraid to take calculated risks.
And then you do work outside of Providence.
I do. I have been volunteering with the American Red Cross as the National Lead for Disaster Spiritual Care. In fact, my leader back in St. Vincent, Sister Farrell Richardson, who just recently died, she invited me to consider opportunities to grow and support those in crisis. That invitation opened an opportunity for me to be engaged with the American Red Cross in disaster spiritual care. It began in 99, and my very first disaster was right after 9/11. I was called to the World Trade Center site and called to support the families and those in New York City. I would call it a river shifting moment. At that time, I was called to be in Brooklyn. I was asked to cover and support the volunteers that were coming in from all over the world to support the operation. And I remember running into a psychologist from Portland. She was drawing a calendar in felt pen, and she was like, "I am not using my gifts at all. This is supposed to be working with kids. That's my specialty. I work with children." And she said, "I'm just drawing a calendar." And I said, "It's true. You probably did give up a lot to be here. This is total chaos. Disasters are moments of complete and utter chaos." And I let her know that it might be simple, mundane things that you're doing, but the reality is you never know what will unfold in the next day or two. And a couple days later, I happened to go to the Family Assistance Center that has a special place. So they have a safe place for children that we created. And so here in that safe place that really has specialized psychologists and counselors and others present are individuals who do that support and a safe place for kids. And I looked up, and here my friend was, who was drawing calendars 2 days earlier. She looked up and said, "I'm where I need to be, and I'm doing what I hoped I would be."
You mentioned primal grief.
Yeah, as part of the work that we did with families and supporting families at the World Trade Center site, there was a family assistance center. I remember one mom who was pregnant, she was holding her belly, and she had lost her husband, and her father was with her. She looked at me and she said, "Have you been down there?" Meaning ground zero. And I said, "Yes." And then she asked, "Was it bad?" She's like, "You don't have to answer that. I could see it in your eyes." I said, "There were just simply no words to describe." And as she boarded the boat and other family members boarded the boat, they were all given yellow hard hats to help them be identified among all of the work that was going on at Ground Zero. And they would take them by boat, and they would be surrounded by military gunships. I remember asking an NYPD policeman, "What's the point of the gunships?" And they said, "We could not have one more thing bad happen to these families." What would happen is the families came through the recovery site. As the families came through the street, there would be a wave of silence that would follow them as they came up to a platform. And when they turned the corner and saw the site for the first time, I often describe, if you had 360-degree vision, you couldn't see all of this destruction at one site. It was so massive and so big that it just overwhelmed your ability to just comprehend it. And as the families came to that spot, they were given space to be completely by themselves or with them, but supported from the distance. And as they came around the corner, the grief that I call the primal grief was their lament, the utter just cry of reality that their loved one was not coming home. What I often say in disaster work, families need to go to the site where it happened. It's not a morbid thing for them to be at a site where their loved ones died. We often describe it as this is the place where their loved ones last. That's why we have cemeteries. It's why we have funerals. It's why we have the things we have, because if I don't have something tangible, I need to go to the closest place where my loved one last drew their breath.
You also talked about the landfill.
I would go early in the morning to get to St. John. I had my Red Cross gear on, but I had one that said chaplain on the back. And so in New York, the F word is pretty common. It's just pretty common. And so I hear this yelling out, "Hey, chaplain." And I turn and I said, "Yes." And he asked, "Hey, are you effing Catholic?" And I said, "I am. I am Catholic." And he said, "Can we talk?" And I said, that's the code word for the rescuers, the first responders was, "Can we talk?" was I need to talk. And so I pulled aside and he said, "I have a question for you." I think he said his son was 10. And he said, "I've been working 20-hour days." And he said, "When I get there, he's asleep. And when I leave before he wakes up." But he said, he asked me a question. He said about those who jumped from the building. He said, if suicide is a mortal sin, then what happens to those people who jumped from the building? And I said, wow. I said, that's a big and a deep question. I've got a similar scenario. I said, if somebody was running down the stairs in the building and they tripped and they fell and they hit their head and died, was that suicide or was that fleeing mortal danger? And he said that would be fleeing danger. And I said, that's exactly right. And he said, that's good. I could use that. He said, I could use that. He said, thank you. But I said, before I leave, I said, you know what, could you stop over at the respite center and pick up a teddy bear? And he said, what for? And I said, your son, he needs to know you're there. He needs to know that you're coming home. I said, put it in his bed when you get home. Then when he wakes up in the next morning after you've already left, he knows you've been there. So he said, I could do that.
Great. I love that. Poor kid, though. That's a heavy thing to carry. I'm glad that you passed him at that moment.
Yeah, many times as people were as they did the recovery work, they recovered the work from the ground zero site, and they would take the debris from the site across the river to Staten Island. And there was a landfill there. That landfill was the place where they brought the remains of those who were lost, and all the parts of the plane were gathered. I remember going out and they'd ask me, could I go out, because there were like 3,000 to 5,000 FBI agents in biohazardous suits through that space. And they said, could you go check on them? And I'm like, yeah, I can. So I remember going out with a driver, and the driver was somebody who lost their job because they worked in the World Trade Center, and she was just driving Red Cross workers wherever they needed to go. We came driving up the long drive of the landfill, and the dump trucks they had that were bringing the debris from barges up to the landfill, and they were separating it out, and there were plane parts in one section and other parts, and then there were conveyor belts that they were placing the soil on, and the conveyor belts went back and forth, and they would drop the soil, would drop through smaller holes. And all these FBI agents were there combing through the debris. And as they found someone who was missing, they would raise a hand or they would call, and they would bring that person out in a respectfully dignified way. And we would honor them with a prayer. It was a prayer that we honored every person who has recovered. And the prayer was, we give thanks for this person's life. We give thanks that this person was found. We ask that they know peace in God's arms and that they be reunited with their families soon.
Wow.
And then the bagpiper would play. Many times Danny Boy, if it was a firefighter or a police officer. Other times Amazing Grace. And in the distance, when you heard the song, the sergeant one time said, there you go. They found another one. And he was alerting me to the cadence and the sacredness that was happening in that space. Everyone there knew what it meant when they heard the bagpipes play, and when they called the chaplain over, and when they asked us to honor the person's life.
Such pain in that time, but it's also beautiful to hear the sacredness of honoring each and every person. I had not heard that part. You see it in the big ceremonies, but not in those moment-to-moment experiences.
Yeah, and that was carried on. I don't even know if I've ever talked about it. That was a moment that those of us in disaster spiritual care and Red Cross, we were originally designed to be supporting airline disasters. This was one that overwhelmed us. But It was the work that was done behind the scenes as every person was recovered, and at every transition point that prayer was shared and honored and prayed. Those who were Jewish had the rabbis there who were praying Shiva, and they were praying the prayers of the dead and honoring them.